Well, now they know. Let it.
He told me you killed him. No, I am your.
Sleigh bells in the snow, the snow, then night.
Hey, Doc, we better back up. We don't have enough road to get up to 88.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need.
My mom always said life was like a box.
To infinity and.
It's time for the announcement. Okay, people, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., Santa's coming to town.
I hope you've been enjoying this Advent season with us. You know, one thing I know about this Christmas season is that, especially for the kids, sometimes for the adults too, but they expect their joy to come from what they're going to get, right? There's this longing and desire to see what that Christmas gift is going to be. But in the Bible, we see that there is actually more joy in giving than receiving. So we need to change our expectation a little bit in terms of where joy comes from. And that's something we're going to learn today through the story of the wise men in Matthew chapter 2 as we continue our journey through the Christmas story. Before we jump in, though, I just want to recap a few things for you. You know, we've learned so far that God does some of his best work in and through interruptions. If you were with us last week, we talked a little bit about how, you know, some of the best ways that God works in our lives is through wrecking some of our plans for the future. And we also talked about how he doesn't do that because he's mean or because he wants to rob us of joy, but he does that because he has better plans for us. And today we're going to talk about how God interrupted Israel's story, you know, and their expectations for the coming of the Messiah with these foreigners that should not have been in the picture. So let's read Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me the word, that I too may come and worship him. And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country another way. So let me tell you, there's so much that we can learn from this passage, you know, but for the sake of time, I want to start by focusing on the story of the wise men. We actually have no idea how many there were. You know, we tend to think of 3 because they came with 3 gifts, but in reality, there could have been as many as 20 or 30. What we do know is that the wise men were magi, right? It was this class of astrologers and really important figures in religious court life in Persian Babylon. So they came from Persia and Babylon, and they probably had been informed by the Jews that were there in exile about the prophecies of a coming Messiah in Israel. In fact, the Magi were likely connected somehow to Daniel, who was a wise man himself, you know, both in the Babylonian and Persian courts. And as Magi, they studied the stars, and they saw something unusual in the heavens. a new star seemed to appear, and they were curious about it. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether this was a real star that can be determined through science or if it was a supernatural appearance, and really could have been both. There's evidence that on May 27th, 7 BC, Jupiter would have come close to Saturn in this particular constellation of Pisces, and then Jupiter was seen as the main god for the Persians. Saturn represented the Jews. Pisces was seen as the representation of the land of Palestine. So if these converged, it might have told them that the true God was coming to the Jews in Palestine, right? The point is that they saw something unusual, and that's what led them to Jerusalem. But when they get there, the star seems to move, and I think we have something else at that point, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the encounter they had with Herod. Herod was clearly paranoid, had already killed his own wife, 2 sons in order to keep the throne. And the wise men probably had no idea that he was that crazy, or they never would have mentioned another king of the Jews being born, right? So Herod tries to trick them to get a little more information on the Messiah, but God protects the wise men by sending them home another direction. What they do get from Herod, though, is information that the child would be born or had been born in Bethlehem, right? And they set out to find a child that they have probably traveled months to see. And this is when a different kind of star seems to appear. And I want to draw your attention to that a little bit. This particular star, that guided them to the house is probably not the same star that got them to Jerusalem. This one moved. So that was a little different. There are multiple times in the Bible when we see an angel being called a star. We see that in Job and Revelation. I believe this was likely an angel that appeared like a star. And its light guided the Magi right to where Jesus was staying. It says that it stopped right over the house and it was shining down on it. And, it was pretty much like the pillar of fire that we see in the wilderness guiding people out of Egypt. And this star guided them to where they needed to go. And I think it's because of that they respond the way that they do. They were pretty excited to be a part of that. It says in verse 10 that they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And it sounds a little redundant, but I think that the meaning here is that they went absolutely crazy. They were jumping up and down of excitement, But it wasn't the star that they were so excited about. It was the fact that they had seen the obvious hand of God. God was moving and they got to be a part of that. That was pretty special. And I believe they responded with that level of worship because when they saw Jesus with Mary and Joseph, even though it probably looked nothing like what they expected, right? Jesus did not seem like a king in the little manger, but that moving light was a sign that their long journey was not a waste. It had been worth it. This was God's Messiah, not just for Israel, but for all nations. And I think that the only appropriate response that they could find was extravagant worship. And when it says that they fell down, the word means that they bowed down to the ground, right? It was a typical Eastern way of recognizing royalty. And then they left their gifts there, gold, frankincense, myrrh. Those gifts were fit for kings, right? And even though all of Israel had no idea what was happening in that little home in Bethlehem, the chosen Messiah had been born. These foreigners from around the world got to see him face to face because they let God interrupt them and they came to worship him. And I don't want us to miss the irony in this moment. The very people that should have received the Messiah, Herod and the people around him are ready to kill him. And the ones that should have missed him are actually there laying their gifts at his feet. In other words, those who should have accepted him rejected him, and those who should have rejected him accepted him. So think about that irony. But if you also think about it, the story is all about flipping conventional worldly wisdom on its head. Because conventional wisdom says that the Jews should have been the one to welcome the Messiah. They were the ones waiting for him. But the story tells us that foreigners did. The wise men that came from the east. Conventional wisdom tells us that it should have been in Jerusalem because that was the capital city, the seat of power. But yeah, it was in a humble home in the village of Bethlehem. Conventional wisdom tells us that they should have been, they should have followed Herod's power and Herod's command. And instead, they followed this moving light of the star. And the ones who were the most blessed in this story were actually the Magi, because they got to see the power of God in that entire story. But right now, worldly conventional wisdom is trying to tell us a bunch of lies. It tells us that if we want to be happy, we need to have a bigger house, a nicer car, better vacations, better gadgets, just a little bit more entertainment and pleasure, and do all these things that we really want to do, because only then will we be happy. We need to spend more on our appearance and on controlling people's perception of us. But that kind of wisdom will only cause us to miss the Messiah when he is right under our nose. In fact, it might even cause us to be troubled at his coming, which is dangerous and scary, But the Magi, they show us a different kind of wisdom. They show us the wisdom of generosity. They show us what it looks like to seek the meaning of life in God, in God himself and his story, and finding joy in him. They show us what happens when we get to be a part of something that can only be explained by God and his power. That's why they rejoice so greatly at what they saw, and that's why they brought the gifts that they did. And church, I believe that God is shining his light and inviting us into something beautiful today. Right now, by God's grace at Fielder Church, God is doing things that would have previously seemed absolutely impossible. We've seen hundreds of people coming to faith. We've seen thousands of new people visiting our church. We've seen miracles at our prayer gatherings, in beautiful ways. God is moving. We've seen his miracles with our own campus. And if we just stop and truly consider it, I think we would be just as overjoyed as the Magi were. And I think we would also be abundantly generous just as they were. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And this card that you guys have in the room is intended to help you respond in faith to what Jesus has done in a way that fights the lies of the world. The world's telling us to get more, but the way of Jesus is actually to give more and more. Jesus himself said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I think that one of the best ways to take the hooks of materialism out of us, especially in this season of the year, is by choosing to give, because generosity is freeing. And this card is a chance for you to ask the Lord what he desires from you. It's a chance to do what the Magi did. And I think there are a few things that I want to share with you that we can learn from the Magi. And if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Yeah, so generosity is about saying yes to God's plan for his money, not your plans for yours. One of the most intriguing aspects of the story of the Magi is that they didn't really have control of what they were to bring, which is mind-blowing. It had been foretold long before they were even born what they should get. I want you to go over to Isaiah chapter 60, and we'll read verses 1 through 3. It says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." So pay attention to what the prophet Isaiah is saying here. There's something special. It says a light would arise, or should we say a star, right? And the nations will come to it. But listen to what it says that they would bring at the end of verses 5 and 6. It says, "The wealth of the nation shall come to you, and a multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord." So again, pay attention to the details that the prophet Isaiah is bringing up here. He's talking about gold and frankincense, talking about good news being brought, talking about the praises of the Lord. This was written about 700 years before the Magi ever came onto the scene, before they ever came to Jesus. It was foretold and preordained exactly what they would give. All they had to do was agree with God to bring it. And honestly, had they chosen not to do it, I firmly believe that God would have chosen someone else from the east to bring it. God's plans would not be affected. They would have been the ones to miss out on that privilege. So again, God would have moved forward with his plans. And here's why I want you to hear this. I believe that God has ordained the expression of our generosity to his church. He's ordained it before we were even born. He knew our financial ability, he knew the resource level that he would have, and he knew what we could and should give. All we have to do is ask him what he desires us to give and say yes to his plan. Because again, his plans are always better than ours. And that's what this card is all about. It's because of this that this second reason that I'm about to point out to you is so exciting to me. I also want you to write this down. It's that you have no idea how much more God can do with your resources than you can. We have no idea what God can do with the little that we put before him. And here's the deal. The Magi had no idea that God would use their gifts to save Jesus' life. We will learn next week that King Herod was trying to get Jesus killed, but Joseph and Mary were able to fund a trip to Egypt for safety, most likely through these gifts. They could sell the frankincense and the myrrh and the gold to flee for safety. And because of their gifts, Herod was not successful with his plan. Jesus still grew up to be in ministry, train disciples, go to the cross, make a way for us to be in a relationship with the Father. And all of that was also possible because these foreign astrologers gave extravagantly to him. In church, I want us to remember that when we give, we will have no idea until heaven how God will use our gifts to change things around us. Hundreds more people will come to Christ this next year. We firmly believe that. We believe that churches will be planted, that marriages will be healed, that unreached people groups will hear the gospel for the first time simply because of the generosity of the church. And that's the generosity that we can give because God has been generous to us in the first place. And that's the invitation that I'm giving to you today, to interrupt your expectations and take the step towards that. And the last truth I want to share with you is that it's best to determine what we will give before we start something new, not after. I don't know if you noticed, but they didn't go buy their Christmas presents for Jesus when they got to Bethlehem. It was before they even left home. They packed the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh. They determined before they ever left what they would give him when they saw him. And that was an act of faith. In other words, they decided what they would bring even before they left. And this is what I'm asking you to consider for next year. I believe that God will reveal himself to you and guide you as you seek him, just as he did with the Magi in this story. And I want you to determine what you are going to bring before you start the new year. This is a good time to do it. It's definitely not only about the money, but it does involve everything we have. It involves every aspect of our lives. And in the Bible, we see this idea of tithe, that as a basic rule, it's good to give God 10% back, just as a sign that everything already belongs to him. And that's why we chose the commitment on the card to be a percentage instead of a dollar amount. And, I still want to challenge you. Do not choose the bare minimum if God is calling you to take a step of faith. For some of you, 10% will not be a sacrifice. And for some of you, starting at even less than that would be honoring to the Lord in this season. So again, go to him and ask that question. That's what I'm inviting you to do. Take a moment to ask him, Lord, what do you want me to give? And please know that this is not anything we're going to require you to pay. It's not a pledge. It's not a promise. It's not anything you're making to us. It's a commitment to God. And you can put your name and email on the card, but this isn't so we can pressure you to give. It's just so we can send you a reminder maybe in 90 days and later in the year of the commitment that you made. But if you don't think that would be helpful for you, then you don't even have to put your name or email in it. This is a way that we have found to serve you, but we don't need it. It's only there if it's beneficial to you. Because again, this is not about getting your money. This is about discipling your heart. God as King, he wants to take over every single area of our lives. Now, here's what I want to invite you to do. If you make these decisions on your own about finances, great. But if you make that decision with someone else, like your spouse, I want to invite you to compare your numbers, if they're here with you or at home, seek the Lord to do that as a family. Come to an agreement and then turn in your card later next week. That is totally okay. But before we wrap up, I just want to tell you something. You know, the greatest gift that you can give Jesus is not your money. He does not need it. You know, he's just fine. It's your heart. And I believe there are some of you here today who have probably followed the world's logic and expecting, you know, money, sex, achievements, whatever it is, whatever plans you have to bring you satisfaction and joy. And all that you have found is disappointment and suffering. And it's time to flip those expectations and trust that only when we die to ourselves and live for Jesus that we can find true joy. You know, so my question for you today is, will you let him rule your life? You know, before you make any financial commitment to Christ, will you give your life to him? That's what he wants most. That's how we can tell Jesus that he is our treasure. You know, so I know we've talked about financial generosity today, but I want to invite you, hey, if you need to take a step to have a relationship with Jesus for the first time, that is the most important thing to do this morning. So I want to invite you to take some time and talk about it as a group, but please do not leave this morning without responding as the Spirit leads you to. God bless you.